I was at home for 3 days for a mini stay-at-home vacation from work. I live in a very rural area, about an hour from the city. Honestly, I hadn't really taken these days off for any particular reason. I guess I was just feeling like I needed a break. It was on my first day off as I stayed at home and watched TV, among doing some other small things around the house. Around dinner time, though, a knock came from the front door. I sat up from the couch and looked at the clock, seeing it was 7 p.m. It was strange for anyone to be at my house in general, but given the time as well, it was even more so. I walked up to the door and cracked it open. A man was on the doorstep, smiling at me. He looked like any other guy, no special features or anything. "What do you need?" I asked, looking around behind him and noticing no car or truck in my driveway. The man maintained his smile as he went through a whole scenario he was in just a few minutes ago. He said he was on the road that connected to my driveway when someone slammed into his car and drove off, leaving him stranded and having to come to me for help. The way he described it, and just from looking at him, things didn't seem to add up. My driveway was far from the road, and the chances he got into an accident right by the entrance was almost zero on such an empty road. I told him I'd call the police for him if he'd like, but the man declined. He said he wanted to borrow my phone to call his wife. It took me a few seconds to respond, because being unsure about the situation made me nervous to say no to him. I said I would call the police and that was it, but the man's smile went away as he said don't worry about it and walked away from the porch. I closed the door, then looked out the window as the man walked down the driveway and disappeared in the dark. After a moment, I called the police just to be safe. About 20 minutes later, though, I got a call back from them saying there were no signs of any crashes on the road. I stayed up late that night, looking out the windows and just being overall a little bit uneasy. But once it got to around 12, I was too tired to stay up. I went upstairs to my bedroom and got ready, then got in bed and fell fast asleep. I remember waking up frantically, but not understanding why. Like maybe I'd heard something in my sleep, but didn't wake up fast enough to comprehend it. Looking over, it was about 3 a.m. I got up from my bed and walked over to the door so I could listen for any sounds in the rest of the house. It was mostly quiet, but I could hear a slight rustling sound from somewhere outside. I carefully walked down the stairs to check on it, thinking it was probably just a bush brushing against the house. But as I got to the downstairs hallway, I realized the sound was moving. It was going along the edge of the house and toward the front. I felt my heart start racing as I tried to reassure myself everything was okay. But then the rustling stopped, and only a moment later, there was a knock at the door. I stood still at the end of the hallway and stared at the front door, terrified of whoever was out there. After a few seconds, I moved away and up to a small window on the side of the house that had a view of the porch. Through the blinds, I could see 2 men, both in dark clothing, and both holding something in their hands. It looked like tools or weapons of some kind. My eyes widened in fear as I backed away and quietly walked back up to my room. More knocking echoed through the house as I called the police and locked myself in. As I stayed on the phone, the knocks turned into banging thuds. I immediately knew it was what I feared. They were trying to break the door down. Hit after hit, non-stop for over 5 minutes, they banged on the door, shaking the whole house. Then the operator on the phone finally said an officer was pulling up to my house, and at that same time, all the banging stopped. When the cop pulled up though, he said he didn't see any men at my door. They must have run off just before he could see them. The door, however, was barely hanging on. The wood was bent and splintered, with only the bolt lock still in place. I was lucky that the police were able to show up quick enough, but I guess I was also smart to have not helped that one man. I'm assuming if I had, I would have only accelerated their plans to do whatever it was they were trying to do. Even today, though, I still worry about them coming back. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of U.S. citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. A year ago, in midwinter, I was staying at an Airbnb on the east coast of the U.S. I had a family member that was sick, and I wanted to be nearby for a few weeks in case of any emergencies. While staying there, I figured I might as well make a vacation of it, since I'd really be doing nothing else, so the Airbnb I got was a modern cabin with a small lake behind it. Most of the area around was a forest as well, so it was really nice and a very different landscape from where I lived. Anyway, about a week after I'd gotten there, I rented out some camping equipment and thought it'd be nice to go out by the lake and maybe spend a night on the beach. The Airbnb was only a short walk away, if there was any trouble, so it wasn't really much of an adventure. I just wanted to lay out by the stars and clear my head, I guess. I made a few walks out to bring all the equipment, then set up the tent. It was actually really easy because it was made for beginners, so I had plenty of time to get everything else set up, as well as a rock circle for the campfire. Once that was all done, I kicked back and relaxed, sipping on a beer as I watched the sunset. The calm sound of the campfire, along with the forest, was something I'd missed, having lived in a big city for so many years. But maybe 20 or so minutes after the sun had set, I was caught off guard by a guy walking up to my campsite. I stood up as a natural reaction, but the man seemed to see my worriness as he stopped walking and put his hands up, apologizing for the scare. He was about the same age as me, mid-30s, but was very tall and skinny. I looked past him at the forest he came from. There was no path that I could see, it was just a bunch of trees that backed up to the lake. "Where did you come from?" The man made a short grin as he said he was just staying in a place on the other side of the lake and saw my campfire, so he thought he'd come out and have a beer with me. I gave a nervous smile, as that wasn't exactly a normal thing to do, way out in the middle of a forest, and on second thought, I was pretty sure there were no houses on the other side of the lake. "I'm actually not looking for company right now. Sorry," I said politely, hoping this could be a quick, harmless interaction. The guy seemed almost puzzled by my response, as his grin went down to a straight face. He glanced at the Airbnb that was behind me and stayed quiet. Then after a few moments of silence, he said okay and walked back the way he came. I watched, trying to keep track of him to see where exactly he was walking to, but he faded out into the darkness of the woods without any flashlight. Feeling pretty unnerved, I decided to grab most of my stuff and haul it back to the Airbnb, not wanting to risk being outside with that guy around. Trying to carry everything at once, though, was a bad move on my part, exhausting me after only getting halfway to the house. And just as soon as I stopped for a breather, I heard heavy footsteps coming from the woods. I turned, seeing the man storming straight out of the tree line and right toward me with a look of insanity in his eyes. I dropped everything and tried to run, but immediately got knocked to the ground. From the speed he tackled me at, we both tumbled on the grass, and I somehow managed to get on my feet before he could get a hold of me again. The guy followed close behind, though, even close enough to grab my shirt a few times in an effort to stop me. When I got to the house, I knew I'd have no time to unlock the door, so I had to go straight for my car. I pulled the keys out of my pocket as I ran up to it, getting inside and locking it just before he got to the door. I turned it on and put it in reverse as the man slammed his fists into the window, shattering it with just a couple punches. He reached in and grabbed my arm as I backed up, swinging the front of the car in his direction. It must have caught him by surprise because he didn't move fast enough to get out of the way. All I saw was his body slam onto the ground and not get up as I drove away. I called for help immediately while I drove, wanting the police to get there quickly to get some answers out of him. But when they got there, the man was gone. All that was left were some shoe prints leading back into the woods. This happened only a few months ago. I work at a small retail store in my hometown as an overnight employee. I do all the regular things like stocking shelves and taking inventory, and sometimes unloading late arrival trucks. The job is very chill, being that I'd usually work alone or with one other person, so nobody is there to boss me around all day. On this night, I was alone until 4 a.m., and I had a lot to do. Over the course of an hour, I was in the aisles the whole time, not needing to go to the back room for anything. But at around 11:30, I thought I heard something from the back. I walked down to the end of the aisle and looked around, then went into the warehouse room, and right as I entered, there was a knock on the back door. That door was only used for truck drivers when delivering a load, but I was never notified about any deliveries this night. Being a large metal door, though, there was no peephole or glass to look out of and see who it was. I walked over to the delivery bay and opened the garage just a crack, and just as I'd assumed, there was no truck. I was almost hoping there would be, though, because now I was really skeptical as to who was knocking on the back door in the middle of the night. A few minutes went by, and no more knocks or sounds came from the door. I even pressed my ear against it and tried to listen, but I was pretty sure whoever had been out there was gone now. Being curious and slightly dumb, I opened the door to make sure nobody was still outside. I peered out into the unlit driveway running behind the building. There were no cars, no people, and not even any sounds. It was just empty and quiet. Seeing this and thinking back to the loud knocking, I felt a shiver go through me, and I closed the door. I walked back to the aisle I was in before and tried to get back to work without worrying too much. Through the next couple hours, I went in and out of the back room several times, but never heard anything else. It was 2 a.m. by this point, and I was finishing up stocking one of the middle aisles, when a very quiet but recognizable sound came from the back. It was the metal door clicking shut. My face went white as I froze up. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I had to check on it. I walked very quietly, still listening as I approached the back doors. At first glance, looking around the warehouse, I didn't see anything, so I made my way further in and toward the back door. It was closed, and being that it only opens from the inside, I was just confused. Trying to think of what could have happened, I turned and looked down the hall of lined-up boxes when I saw a figure facing me. He stood at the end of the hallway, seeming to have just rounded the corner and not expecting to see me. But after a short moment of shock, the man started sprinting at me. He was large and intimidating, with a look of anger in his eyes as he came barreling down the hallway. I ran for the door and into the grocery aisles, trying to make it to the front of the store. The man's footsteps coming up behind me were horrifying, but by the time I got to the front, the footsteps had stopped. I pulled my keys out and unlocked the door, and as I shoved the door open, I looked to my side and saw the man standing at the end of the aisle, just watching me. Without hesitation, I ran out into the parking lot and into my car, calling 911. By the time the cops arrived, the man was long gone, with no traces of where he went. Through the security footage, we could see the man wedging something into the back door that somehow unlocked it, allowing him to get inside. Once he was in, he looked around as if trying to find something particular before he saw me and chased me to the front. Why he let me leave and why he even broke in is still unknown. I don't know what would have happened had the man caught up to me or decided to not let me leave, but I'm just thankful it never had to come to that. I am an Eagle Scout in Ohio, and I do a lot of camping. During most of these trips, I go fishing because it helps me get away from the younger scouts. This trip started out very enjoyable. We ate, played capture the flag, and had a great time. When it got dark, most people went to bed. But my friend and I decided to go fishing around midnight. We walked to a lake that was about 1.5 miles from the campsite, but I always thought the long walk was part of the fun, so it felt normal to us. When we arrived, we heard the usual sounds of crickets and frogs. We sat down, set up our fishing poles and enjoyed the night view. After about 45 minutes, something started to happen. First, all the crickets, frogs, and night creatures suddenly went quiet. All the usual night noises just stopped, and the silence felt even louder than the sounds before. As someone who spends a lot of time outdoors, I know this strange silence is always a bad sign. Honestly, we started to feel a bit scared. After enduring this weird silence for a few minutes, we decided to go back to camp. And that's when things got really scary. While we were packing up our fishing gear, we heard a really loud screech from across the lake, and we heard branches breaking. We stood there feeling terrified as these sounds moved closer around the lake, coming towards us. To make things scarier, it was getting closer slowly. Both my friend and I know a lot about animal sounds, especially the ones around here, but we've never heard anything like this before. We were so scared that we grabbed our pocket knives right away, but I had a feeling they wouldn't do much to help us. We were both just 15 at the time, and whatever was out there seemed to be breaking those branches effortlessly. We looked around, searching for somewhere to hide. Then, we spotted one of those fixed bathrooms with a door almost off its hinges, except for the plexiglass window. So, we dashed over to the bathroom. We both crouched down inside and tried to be as silent as we could. We heard sounds right outside, by the lake. Now, being the curious person I am, I couldn't resist taking a peek. I looked out of the window and saw the scariest thing I've ever seen. There was something right where we were fishing before. It was really pale and super skinny. It had long arms with what looked like claws at the ends. It felt like it knew someone was watching, because it suddenly turned around. And then, it looked straight at me. I quickly slid back down to hide, and we locked the latrine door. Then, we heard scratching right outside. Neither of us dared to look out there. But that wasn't even the scariest part. As we huddled in fear on the floor of the latrine, we heard something outside say, "Scouts, what are you doing in the latrine?" It sounded just like my scoutmaster, but it wasn't him. It was like his voice was twisted and strange. All night long, we listened to this thing outside. Finally, when dawn came, the noises outside faded away. We waited a few hours after dawn. I think it was around 9:30. Slowly, we came out of hiding, our faces pale with fear. We went back to camp, and we promised each other not to tell anyone. Only recently, while researching Native American legends, did we realize that what we encountered must have been a Wendigo. After that, we made a decision. Whenever we were brave enough to go fishing again, we'd bring more protection. A part of me was curious to see that thing again. Maybe even confront it to find out if it really was a supernatural creature like the Wendigo. But to this day, our fishing poles were gone when we came out, and we still have no idea what happened to them. This happened in 2007 when I was 9 years old. My family loves being outside. Like every year, that summer, my dad, my two brothers, Luke, 15 years old, and Owen, 12 years old, and I went camping in Virginia. I can't remember the name of the place, but it was surrounded by trees and had a beautiful lake nearby. We set up our tent near the lake, and during the first few days, we did a lot of fun activities. On the morning of the fourth day, my brothers and I woke up early to go for a swim. There was a big lake near our tent that we couldn't see from the campsite. After quickly eating breakfast, we put on our swim trunks, grabbed our fishing gear just in case, and headed to the lake. My oldest brother Luke was more interested in the big fishing pier at the lake. When we got to the lake, we saw two people already fishing. There was a man in his 40s, and what looked like his son, who seemed to be around 14. When the boy saw us in our swim trunks, he stood up and said, "I wouldn't swim there if I were you. There are a lot of garfish around, and they can really cut you up." I look at Owen, who just shrugged, and without thinking much, he jumped into the water head first. I didn't want to miss out on the fun, so I followed him and jumped in too. Luke, meanwhile, sat down next to the boy and started setting up his fishing pole. We swam for about 15 minutes, slowly moving away from the shore. The water was super deep, maybe around 20 feet. But we didn't really think about it much, because Owen and I were both good swimmers from being on the swim team back home. At one point, I was swimming underwater with my eyes closed, feeling the nice cool water, when suddenly I felt someone grab my ankle. I was so surprised that I quickly opened my eyes and pulled my leg away. His hand gripped my ankle tightly, and I felt irritated. I turned to push him away, but then I saw something strange. It wasn't Owen. It had long bluish-green hair floating around its head, completely black eyes, and long legs with wide-webbed feet. Its claws looked like a cat's, curved and sharp, ready to grab hold and not release. I stared as it opened its mouth, showing rows of small, sharp teeth. It dragged me down deeper into the dark water. I panicked and reacted on instinct. I kicked and screamed, letting out air by mistake. But I kicked the creature with my other foot, trying to get away. It opened its scary mouth again and let out a scream. It scratched my leg with its sharp claws, causing a lot of pain. Soon after, I saw my red collar floating up in the water. I was bleeding, and I knew I couldn't win against this thing. My head was spinning, and I could barely see clearly anymore. I felt a strange relief knowing I'd drowned before that creature could hurt me more. I was losing energy and closed my eyes. Suddenly, I felt strong hands grab my arms and pull me up to the surface. My leg hurt a lot, and I could see it was cut badly. Luke and Owen helped me back to our campsite and woke up Dad. They rushed me to the emergency room. After they cleaned up all the blood, my leg was okay, and I didn't need stitches. But I still have faint scars from that day. Later, they told me that when I didn't come back up, Luke got scared and went to look for me with Owen. They said they saw something swimming away really fast in the water when they found me, but it disappeared before they could see it clearly. I told everyone about the strange creature. I shared every detail I remembered. But nobody believed me. They thought I was just imagining things. They said it was probably one of the gar the boy had warned us about. But I'm sure of what I saw. My eyes didn't lie to me that day. So if anyone knows what that thing might have been, I'd really like to hear about it. A friend of mine, let's call him John, always liked fishing and being alone. Once we finished school, I didn't hear from him for a while. Then last month, when we met at a grocery store, he had an interesting story to share. John always liked fishing, so we used to go to lakes where there were lots of trout, so we could catch some fish and eat it for dinner. We have lots of places to fish here, along with many, many miles of only woods. Except for sometimes there's a lake or road. There are a few houses on the outer edge of that area, but otherwise, it's far out in the wilderness. In this area, there's a place that old Swedish stories say young people went to dance on Midsummer's Eve. The stories tell of a girl who was going to get married. On Midsummer's night, a man dressed in black came from the shadows and danced with her so much that her feet started bleeding. Then he dragged her into the lake. Since that day, they say no grass will grow on that spot, and I've seen it myself in the little lake. Anyway, so John packed his bike and headed out to one of these lakes. At one point, he passed the haunted lake from the stories, but he didn't stop there. He kept biking to another lake that had much nicer, with less creepy surroundings. There was a windbreak, and the woods around it were dark and old, except for the open meadow behind it. The meadow was bright and full of flowers. One thing about Swedish summer is that it never gets really dark. Even at night, there's still some light in the sky. In the evening, mist rises over the lake and makes weird shapes. These shapes look like they're dancing, and we call this the elf dance. John started fishing and grilled the fish he caught over an open fire. The only sounds were the seabirds that came out in the evening, making their creepy howling noises. Then, when he felt tired, he went into the shed and laid down in his sleeping bag. He kept his bag with a big hunting knife next to him, just in case. He was just about to fall asleep when he heard something coming from the meadow behind the shed. There was a window in the shed that let him look out at the lake, but John could only see the sky and the darkness. The footsteps were loud and firm, like someone marching in rubber boots. John yelled out, "Who's there?" His voice echoed over the lake, and the marching stopped. John didn't know what to think. Maybe it was one of his friends playing a joke on him. But if it was, why didn't they answer or keep walking? There was dead silence. John could only hear his heart pounding in his ears. The person who was walking toward the shed had stopped now, and they knew that John was inside. He carefully grabbed his hunting knife and crawled up with his back against the wall. Then he held his knife with both hands in front of him and waited. Still silence. Had the person in rubber boots sneaked away into the quiet, or was he still standing right behind the shed? Maybe 15 minutes passed when suddenly a dark figure jumped into the shed and attacked John. John didn't have time to react. He felt something stab itself on the knife he held in front of him. Then it turned and ran out of the shed, sprinting down the lake toward the woods. John grabbed his gear and ran in the opposite direction as fast as he could. He ran until he reached the houses and pounded on the first door he found in the middle of the night. He left his bike and everything else he couldn't carry. I told him about this a few months ago, and he confirmed it. He said it was strange because there wasn't really anywhere to run by the lake. But somehow, this big black thing or person disappeared without a trace. I lived by this pond for more than 18 years. At first it was a small pond on a farm, with fields and thick woods all around. But over time, things changed. Now, the pond sits between 3 big neighborhoods and a swimming pool. It's only separated from all that by a thin layer of wood. I think the pond was made back in the early 1900s, and there were 2 lines of barbed wire in the pond, making a cross shape. I don't know why there was barbed wire in the pond. There were just 2 very old houses on the right side of it, and a neighborhood about 100 yards away on the left, near the woods. When I was a kid, we always talked about the pond like it was some kind of mystery. None of us dared to explore it. But 10 years later, I became really into fishing. After school, I'd go out almost every day to check out new places to fish and find the best spots. Nowhere else was as easy to get to or had as many fish as this pond. I came here almost every other day. One strange thing that happened was during a summer night. I stayed out late, hoping to catch a few more fish. Suddenly bright lights shone from behind me, like a big truck had just parked with its bright lights on. I quickly turned around, thinking maybe a car had just parked in one of the driveways at the houses. I turned around thinking maybe a car had parked in the driveway of the houses about 100 yards behind me, through the woods. But there was nothing there. And the way the lights shone, it couldn't have come from headlights anyway. So I decided to call it a night, and headed back down the trail toward the parking lot by the pool nearby. The second strange thing happened months later on a very eventful evening. A friend of mine and I, along with a couple of girls, went to the pond to hang out after school. While we were there, at the same spot as before, we saw a small child, about 3 to 5 years old, running from an old house on the other side of the pond. We were worried, so we told the kid what he was doing and where his parents were. The kid didn't seem to care about our questions. Then suddenly, he turned around and started talking to someone who wasn't there. It seemed like the person he was talking to was telling him to go back to his parents. But the kid was arguing, saying he just wanted to play with him instead. And then the craziest thing happened. The kid started pointing toward the water, saying, "Look, it's my dog. Do you see him?" Then he was pointing right at the center of the pond. We told him where his dog was. He said, "He's in the water, barking at me. That's where he drowned a year ago." We all stood there, speechless for a moment, then took the kid back to the other side of the pond, where his dad met us and took him home. I know kids have wild imaginations and make up imaginary friends, but this felt real to me. It seemed like the kid was actually talking to someone who wasn't there and reacting to what they were saying. I have a bunch of other wild stories about things I've seen at this spot or heard about this spot. Maybe one day I'll share those too. I went to a fancy college that wasn't open to everyone. It was great, and I liked it a lot. But there's this one scary thing I'll always remember. Around 7 p.m., I came back from getting food in the cafeteria. As I made my way back to my dorm room, I noticed something odd. A man was walking in the hallways. Now, it's important to mention that my dorm was only for females, so seeing a man there was weird. I thought maybe he was visiting someone, which happens sometimes. But what made it strange was that he looked like he was in his 30s. Anyway, I didn't pay much attention and went to my room. It was a Friday, and my roommate had gone home for the weekend. I finished all my homework for the weekend and then started watching TV. About an hour later, I went to the bathroom across the hall, which was convenient. When I got back to my room and resumed my show, then after about 10 minutes, I heard a noise from the other side of my room. I was so into my show that I didn't really pay much attention to it. That is, until I heard it again, and this time it was louder. I turned my head to see what it was, and I couldn't believe what I saw. It was a man coming out from behind my roommate's desk. In fact, it was the same man I saw in the hallway earlier. He had a smile on his face and was walking right towards me. I screamed and ran for the door as fast as I could. I just managed to get out of my room, slamming the door shut behind me, and then I ran down the hall. He didn't follow me. He shouted after me, saying it was a mistake and he thought I was someone else. But with that creepy smile he had, I didn't believe him. I ran to my friend's dorm, which was on the floor above mine, and we called the campus police. They came pretty quickly, and they caught a man leaving the building. It turned out someone had let him into the building earlier, and he got into my room because I had left my door unlocked when I went to use the bathroom. I felt a mix of relief and fear as I realized how close I had been to something much worse happening. I believe in paranormal, and I can say this was one of the most scary experiences I've ever had. So this all started when one day, my dad told me that he and his ex-girlfriend went to an old forgotten graveyard in a lonely part of South Carolina. The locals call the graveyard Witches and Morlocks because it has graves from the 1600s and 1700s. There is a very old farm right in front of the graveyard that is now private property. A long time ago, this farm had a well where slaves were drowned. To make a long story short, my dad and his girlfriend heard strange noises while walking through the graves. They even caught the noises on his night camera. He said it sounded like a sizzling noise coming from the trees, but the nearest thing that could make that noise was about 12 miles away. The sound kept getting louder until my dad and his girlfriend drove away in a panic. Fast forward 19 years, and my dad and I were driving to the same area while he told me the story about the well. Unfortunately, I couldn't see the well because it was too dark. After a black dog scared us and we drove deeper into the old abandoned woods, I started to feel excited and nervous. I looked out at the dark treetops, the dirt road, and the square fences that surrounded the fields with the well. I remember seeing things that looked like hanging bodies and faces in the tall grass, like when you see shapes in clouds. I didn't think much of it at the time. My dad explained that the deeper you go into the forest, the creepier it gets, and he wasn't kidding. The feeling of anticipation kept growing. We reached the end of the forest, and we could still see the abandoned shed on the farm. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the tops of unmarked graves in the tall grass. Feeling excited, I looked into the dark graveyard through my open window. I blinked once and saw something hovering over a grave. It looked like a floating white dress with puffy sleeves and a fading hem. I could barely see a faint white arm poking through the sleeves. And even now, the images are stuck in my head like a picture. Suddenly, a sick feeling ruined my excitement, and I felt like I was going to throw up. I got scared and told my dad about the dress I saw. He said it was probably just a smudge on the window, but the window was open. We shone our flashlights across the dead grass, hoping to see something else. I felt like crying and begged my dad to drive back. I wanted to go back to the place, hoping to see the dress again. My dad chuckled and said it was probably something I ate, but this wasn't food-related nausea. It was fear. Cold fear tingled on my skin, and I felt frozen with fright. When I shone my flashlight on the graves, I saw no dress, no body. It was here. The dress was right here. I pointed to the top of a grave about 3 feet tall, breathing heavily and fast. And more fear crept up my spine. But now I can't stop wanting to go back to that place. I want to see the dress again. Maybe this Halloween, I'll get another look at the place. I'm scared to go back, but at the same time, I can't stop wanting to do it. This happened a long time ago, and thinking about it still creeps me out. I live in Adair County, Kentucky on a horse farm, and one day in summer about 5 to 6 years ago, my mother, who's the horse enthusiast in our family, found a horse that she wanted for sale in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. We'll call the seller of this horse James. For those of you who don't know, Lawrenceburg is one of several places in Kentucky who have claimed to see Kentucky's version of Bigfoot, and they call it the hillbilly beast, which has been spotted all over Kentucky. Me and my little brother, being suckers for those kinds of things, like most kids, went with her hoping to see it. Fast forward, James' house was far from town and on a one-way dirt road miles from anywhere. Only a few houses were dotted here and there on the side of the road, but this one I will seriously never forget. We were about 5 minutes away from the person's house we were getting the horse from, and going quite slow because we had a trailer hooked to the back of our truck. I'm staring out the window, hoping to see the hillbilly beast somewhere in the woods, along the side of the road, when I saw this house. This house had well over 20 mannequins throughout their yard, all shapes and sizes. Most were laying down or propped against what looked like a shed. There were two that really freaked me out. One was an adult female tied to a tree next to the road, so close I could probably touch it if I rolled down the window and stuck my hand out. The second was the size of a baby. This one was nailed to a tree only a couple of yards away. Both of them looked really old and worn out, moldy, rotting, etc. My mom stopped the car and we were all just sitting there staring at this place. The house was old and run down, but obviously being lived in. The shed next to it looked almost brand new, minus what looked like satanic graffiti written all over it. So being freaked out, we drove away. Fast forward again. Once we got to James, we asked him about the freaky mannequin place. He said he never saw anything like it. He also said he was in town just that morning and took that exact road, so it's likely he would have seen it. Once we left his house, we took a different way home, so we didn't see this mannequin house again. Part of me says this could have been some freaky prank. The other part of me is wondering, what if they weren't mannequins? I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just saying, my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, and my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I had a phone. The story begins when a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. I could never train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was sweet, if not the brightest dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. It's hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching me. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking at my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks half a mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Someone, something was waiting for me. It followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily. Footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. At night, it was out there around the cabin. Here's a funny thing, I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all. At least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. In the Frederick Municipal Forest, went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I, we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods. Traces of fires and old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in. Garbage, food and drink, paper. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch, screened with a light door, and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard, with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, and a rabbit, and even a weasel one day. Like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them. This went on almost daily for several weeks. But one night, very late, I was awoken by some sounds. I lay in bed and I heard something from the porch. I hopped up and hid the lights, and I saw that hound dog, who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door, in a perfect point position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out, It had been on my porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It was not funny. The two final gifts were legs from either horses or cows, big and bloody. One was skinned. I mean, holy shit. The second to the last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods, howling on a trail, following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland suburbs of DC, got an apartment with a friend, got a job and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It described a tall Yeti-like creature, fur covered on two legs, that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick. Back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way. Country folks. I think the monster was an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now. Probably off his meds, but somehow functional and lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do. He would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed I was leaving. I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I do not think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets, and they took away the shelter of hospitals. When protected, the mentally ill died. Okay, so around 9 or 10 years ago, I was living with my mom, my dad, and older sister in an oldish house in a very small village. When I say small, I mean its only main feature was a small church and a few scattered houses occupied mostly by old people. At the time it was the summer, so I wasn't at school or anything, and since we were so far in the middle of nowhere, I spent most of that time at home, glued to one screen or another. The usual routine was I'd wake up at around 10 or 11. By this point, my mom, dad, and sister had all left for work, so I had the house to myself. I'd go downstairs, make some toast, watch some random stuff on TV for an hour, before heading back to my room to continue with whatever game I was grinding through that particular day. The habits of a usual 17-year-old guy cut off from the world by many, many fields. I should give a quick rundown of our house. It was an older cottage with 2 rooms upstairs, mine and my sister's, and everything else is downstairs. As you walk up the stairs, you got to a very small landing and could either go left to my room or immediate right, my sister's room. Basically, the way this was laid out was that I could sit in my room with the door open, and my sister's room is directly opposite. I should also mention that the ceilings in both of our bedrooms were slanted. We were basically in a large attic where the roof slanted down. Because of where the slant met the wall, we had a crawl space that ran the length of the house on either side of the rooms, both with a small door to access them. These were mostly used for storing normal attic stuff like Christmas decorations or old forgotten toys. The doors to these were thin little things, about 4 feet tall, with a small handle on the outside. This is very important because throwing these tiny doorknobs opened them, but only from the outside. If the door was pushed shut with you inside, there was no way back out. I discovered this myself on more than one occasion. The door on my side ran along my room and along one wall in my sister's room, and hers ran along the other side, along my room. The space was not very big. You had to crouch or stand in it, and most of the time you were in there, you were crawling on hands and knees. Anyway, this one morning I'm awoken to a familiar noise. Some sort of small creature rustling around in the crawl space on my sister's side. I could hear this because my bed was against the wall that ran along it. Not an unusual noise. Living in the countryside, we had mice almost constantly. They pretty much owned the storage spaces, no matter how many traps were put down. I thought nothing of it, and I got up and went off to begin my morning ritual of toast and television. The first odd thing I noticed was while watching TV, I could hear movement upstairs. My mom's room was directly above the living room, so I assumed she'd just not gone to work that day for whatever reason, and I continued munching. Around an hour or two later, I went back upstairs and booted my PC. As I was waiting, I turned around to my open door and faced my sister's closed one, and realized it was late in the day and she had yet to leave her room. An odd thing, since she normally parked up on the sofa in the living room on her days off and didn't move until our parents returned. We are not the most active family. I started to think that maybe she was at work and I'd imagined the noise from upstairs. But as I mused this, I noticed the crack of light at the bottom of her door as a shadow passed by it. Okay, so there's definitely someone in there, so it must be her. I once again pushed it from my mind and went back to my PC. More time passed, and the thought came back to me. Why would she be at home but not leave? She only has a small TV in her room and no books, so what has she been doing in there all day? I glanced back around and again saw a shadow under the door. She was still moving around in there, so what was up? I finally decided to go knock on her door. I knocked a few times and said her name. No answer. Weird, but maybe she had headphones on or something. I knocked a bit harder again and said her name again, but louder. No answer again. Alright, I thought, screw this, I'm just going to go in, so I cracked the door open and peered around. I found an empty room. Nobody inside at all. Slightly confused, but feeling better there was just my imagination, I stepped in properly and looked around and saw something that made me full-on panic. Near the bottom of her little door leading to the crawl space, there was a small hole that the mice had made to get in and out at the bottom. Really small, but just big enough to fit half of your hand through. There, coming through that hole, were 4 fingers, holding the door shut from the inside. At first I thought, no, it can't be fingers, don't be stupid, until I watched them slowly creep back through the hole, into the crawl space. I lost my shit. Very quietly though, I might add. I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me, and ran to my room. Being the stupid teenager I was, I grabbed what might be the most imposing weapon I could find. The fake Winchester rifle cap gun I got from Disneyland a few years previous. I figured that if whoever was hiding in that bedroom didn't believe it was a real firearm, I could at least hit them with it. I ran off downstairs to where my dogs were on the far side of the house. I called my mom, who worked about a 5-minute drive from our house. She told me to stay put, and that her and her manager were on their way. In this time, I made a small upgrade, from fake plastic rifle to one of my dad's golf clubs. I felt much better with it. Finally, my mom and her boss, John, turned up. I told them everything leading up to this point. They say okay, and we all set off upstairs to investigate. Me, not very heroically, behind them with my golf club. We get to my sister's room and I point to the door. I'll never know if my mom is just as hard as nails or massively stupid, but while John and I watch, she marches over to the door, yanks it open and sticks her head in. A moment passes while she looks left and right, and John and I are preparing to yank her back from the clutches of the psycho oboe murderer, hiding in there before she shouts, "Chris, what the fuck are you doing in there? Get out." Small amount of backstory. Chris was my sister's boyfriend. Unbeknownst to me, the night before my dad had asked Chris to leave, as he stayed with us for about 5 days at this point. He said, "Yep, that's cool," and as far as mom and dad knew, he'd headed home. What really happened was instead of him leaving, him and my sister had planned to make it seem like he left, then he could stay another night. He would then wake up before my mom shouted my sister out for work, like she did every morning, and would hide in the crawl space and sleep in there until everyone had left for the day. But one small hitch in the plan that they did not think of was, you guessed it, me. They had forgotten I was home and conveniently sat directly opposite the only exit for most of the day, so he was trapped. When I knocked, he hid himself behind the door and held it shut to prevent being locked in. Anyway, my mom swiftly told him to get the hell out and to not come back. Sadly, this was not the last time we saw the guy. As it turned out, he'd stolen quite a bit of money from my sister's room, while he'd been hiding out. And then, because my sister makes terrible decisions, got her pregnant and proceeded to smash windows, trying to get at her and the baby around a year later. For a while, we lived in the same city when I went to uni, and he was spending time at the prison there for stabbing someone in a completely different town. Super great guy. Oh, and a small topper to all of this. As I mentioned earlier, the only rooms upstairs are mine and my sister's bedrooms. He'd been in there for close to 14 hours with no access to a toilet. But don't worry for this guy, because he had a lot of empty bottles to piss in, which he kindly left behind for us to clean up. And finally, around a year later, my mom was getting the Christmas decorations out, which were at the far back of the storage space. She found a small bag filled with feces. I should mention where she found it is exactly next to where my bed is, on the other side of the wall. That rustling that woke me up that day, it was him, hiding his shit amongst our tinsel and tree. I could give you a million times as a kid and young adult, I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost. Not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of forts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, our friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed maybe, and play Monopoly. For sake of the backstory, on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants he came across. He had no fear of going out camping by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he's probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was probably just paranoia, but still not a good feeling. Anyways, the camp is set and the fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs some wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up having a good time. My friend is sitting on the swivel chair he always brought and loading up this makeshift bong. Now is crouched, breaking some excess limbs off of some of the logs that we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. Breeze went through just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again. Definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch in the underbrush. I knew by the sound they had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy." And when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second that the leaves covered the fire, we were in complete darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there and neither of us took our eyes off of the spot, or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched and it slowly walked off. Whenever it was, had sat crouched watching us, without moving, for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill. Spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went to the tents, and I had a very short night's sleep, sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day we talk about it. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since. To set the tone, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college, and I quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of not decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently, and there were shootings in broad daylight. Robberies, you name it. Well, for the first 3 years, I lived with roommates on a side of town that wasn't awful, but it was sketchy. So when I was making decent enough money, I moved out on my own. The house was tiny, maybe 500 square feet, if that. Super old and poorly built. It was just me living there, so I didn't mind how small it was. But what originally sold me was that it was in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and some wooded areas, with only a few houses nearby. Considering I hated being in the town due to the continuous paranoia of getting mugged or shot, I loved the idea of living out there. So at the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. But a month goes by and everything is still swell to me, and I decide to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place and spent long amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. Roughly 2 months into living there, I started to notice things out of place. Something for me to know is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as a storage space until he got moved himself. So he had a key but was never there. Kinda just popped in once every other week to grab something. He would usually let me know beforehand. But I would come home to find my kitchen chair being pulled away from my table, or a bowl in the sink, things like that. There are very small things. I wrote it off as my roommate swinging by or just stuff I was forgetting. Then my dog developed this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He would just lay on the couch and chew his toys. He never barked, never did anything weird. But all of a sudden, he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He would literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and wouldn't stop until I came back in the house. He didn't want me to leave him there alone at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him, so I decided one day that I'd put a movie in while I was out, thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task of that work, and I knew I'd be home early, so I put in a copy of Hamlet. I know that's a boring movie, but I chose it because the copy I have is about 5 hours long, so I knew I'd be playing when I came back. Fast forward 3 hours, long before Hamlet should have been over. I walked in the door. Not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and the Xbox were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over, and he wasn't even in town. I explained the TV situation to him, and he shrugged it off as a TV powering off when it idles for a while. Even though this is true, there are several reasons I know this isn't the case. For one, it wasn't idling. A 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. 2, even if it had shut off, my Xbox wouldn't have. I had left it on by accident for weeks while I was out of town or whatever, and it was still on when I came home. Always. But it was completely powered down this time. The weird thing is, none of my stuff was missing and the door was locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself that it was something weird with the Xbox or whatever, and I shrugged it off. That is until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she even walked by the house while he was out, he started yelping and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me and made me incredibly cautious of her. I put some cheap alarms on my doors, the kind that go off when the door is open, and I slept with my pistol handy. The second night, the alarms were on my doors. I was woken up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of my bed with my pistol, tried to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. But once I got to the door, it was shut, and there was nobody there. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room. The door would have had to open for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and landed there. Something else weird, the door was locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt. Upon checking my lock after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police wouldn't do much as I had no witnesses and no leads, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the locks. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that. But I later found out that the close neighbor that my dog hated had previously lived in the house I was renting, and the locks had never been changed. I have no way to prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. Why, though, I can't figure out. Nothing of mine ever went missing. The most unsettling part for me, though, is that she had tried to come in at night until an alarm scared her off. How many times has she been in my house at night while I was asleep, and why?